On the night of January 8, 1999, a man took the breath of his newlywed wife, hid her body in a suitcase, and burned it beneath an icy lake. That ill-fated woman was Julie Marie Scully. The beautiful young woman had once been a well-known model, living a luxurious life with a husband who loved her deeply. But over time, Julie grew tired of a boring marriage, and then she met George, a poor, balding, weathered man. Julie chose to give up her life of riches in pursuit of a new love and move to a remote town to get married. But who could have guessed that this decision would lead her to such a tragic ending? Why would Julie, someone who seemed to be basking in newfound happiness, meet such a cruel fate? Julie's story is not just about love and betrayal, but also about the secrets hidden behind closed doors. You're watching my YouTube channel, where we uncover some of the most mysterious crimes and thrilling stories you've never heard before. And as always, before we dive into this case, don't hesitate. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to support us. Thank you so much. On July 8, 1989, Tim Nist, a successful 32-year-old businessman, met Julie, a vibrant 21-year-old woman sunbathing on the beach. Her tan skin glowing in the summer sunlight, Tim fell in love with her at first sight. From that moment, their lives were intertwined and they became inseparable. They shared sweet, blissful days together. Tim's love for Julie wasn't just emotional, it was supportive, guiding, and full of responsibility. He was her mentor, helping Julie step by step to reach her dreams. With Tim's encouragement, Julie signed up for a beauty pageant. In no time, she advanced through the rounds and reached the finals. From that moment, Julie's life took a dramatic turn. She became determined to pursue a career as a professional model, despite all obstacles. During the day, she still worked at Tim's office helping with business matters, but when night fell, Julie immersed herself in the modeling world. She kept practicing tirelessly, striving to conquer the dazzling path ahead. With unwavering determination, Julie applied for a bikini modeling competition. And when the magazine was published, the entire town began to recognize the name Julie Marie Scully. Her career began to rise quickly, turning her into a local star. She drew attention at many public events, where she met not only the mayor but also influential people. By the fall of 1990, Julie had officially stepped onto the stage of glory and was crowned a beauty queen. But happiness didn't last long. On November 16, 1991, Julie and Tim held their wedding ceremony at a large church in Hamilton Square, New Jersey. From the outside, their life seemed like a dream: successful, happy, and wealthy. However, cracks in their marriage started to appear as Julie's career flourished more than ever. The two began to grow distant and stopped attending events together. Julie, who once believed in Tim's love, began to have doubts. What was strange was that, despite all the attention Julie received from other men for her beauty, Tim didn't seem to care. He wasn't jealous, he didn't pay much attention, as if his love for her had faded long ago. In February 1995, Julie became pregnant with their first child. But from that point on, her life began a new chapter, one filled with difficulties and challenges. During her pregnancy, Julie gained significant weight. It reminded her of her glamorous modeling days, and the changes in both her body and mind started to take a toll. Her personality became more sensitive and irritable, and her behavior increasingly unpredictable. In November of the same year, Julie gave birth to a baby girl. However, the short-lived joy quickly faded. Just a few months later, Julie fell into a deep depression. Despite trying her best, she couldn't regain her previous figure, and her modeling career gradually faded away. She reluctantly settled into the role of a full-time mother, burdened by silent sorrow. Even worse, Julie realized she had lost feelings for her husband. The relationship she once cherished had now become empty. By April 1997, Julie and Tim decided to go to marriage counseling, hoping to salvage their relationship. but the effort didn't seem to bring much change. In November that same year, they planned a second Caribbean cruise, hoping the trip would rekindle their bond. And it did change everything, but not in the way Julie had hoped. During the trip, 29-year-old Julie met a sailor named George Skyadopoulos, a 23-year-old man with rugged looks and a complicated past. George was born and raised in Greece. As a child, his family fell apart, leaving him with deep resentment toward his father's infidelity. The tension escalated to the point where George attacked his father with a knife. After graduating from university, he chose a life at sea and started working aboard the cruise ship Galaxy, the very one Julie and Tim were on. The encounter between Julie and George marked the beginning of a dramatic and dangerous chain of events, a turning point in Julie's already turbulent life. When George first saw Julie on the Galaxy, he was captivated by her dazzling appearance, especially the expensive dress and the striking diamond ring. This made him silently remember her name and nurture the hope of flirting with her. The next day, when the Galaxy ship docked, George intentionally approached Julie, acting confident and lying that he was a senior officer on the ship. Julie was immediately impressed by George's foreign demeanor, and they clicked instantly. On the night before the ship was scheduled to depart again, George enthusiastically invited both Julie and Tim to tour the ship. On November 8, 1997, after the trip ended, Julie and Tim said goodbye to George and returned to New Jersey. Tim quickly forgot the unremarkable sailor, but Julie couldn't stop thinking about him. In the following days, George kept sending messages and calling Julie, complimenting her and implying she deserved a man who truly appreciated her. Sometimes, Tim answered the phone when George called, but surprisingly, he didn't suspect anything and even handed the phone to Julie without a second thought. This vulnerable stage, Julie gradually transferred all her passion and hope onto George without knowing that just moments after flattering her, George would be flirting with another female co-worker on the ship. In January 1998, on her 30th birthday, Julie once again chose the Galaxy ship to celebrate with her husband and friends. George furthered the relationship by inviting her for drinks. George welcomed Julie like an old friend, and in those rare private moments, Julie opened up about the cracks in her marriage. She spoke of feeling trapped and hopeless, unable to find a way out. With charm and understanding, George invited Julie back to his cabin so they could connect more deeply. Hours later, Julie quietly returned to her husband, but her heart was no longer with him. Deep down, she believed George was the man she had always been searching for. After the trip ended, Tim began to notice changes in Julie. She became distant and cold. One day, in the kitchen, Tim discovered a photo showing only half of George's face. When he asked Julie about it, she casually replied that it was a gift from George. Tim couldn't imagine that his beautiful wife could be drawn to a man like George, a balding sailor he barely noticed. On March 26, 1998, Julie returned once again to New Jersey, but this time, it wasn't to return to her old life. Having completely given her heart to George, she was now determined to make big changes in her life. After nearly 7 years of marriage, Tim, sensing their relationship was exhausted, suggested one last round of marriage counseling. But he had no idea that the true cause of their constant arguments was Julie's love for another man. When Julie refused counseling and said she wanted to live alone, Tim, in anger, suggested they should divorce. In early June, Tim moved out to live alone in an apartment, cutting off all contact and financial support. He told her he wouldn't spend another dime on her, but Julie didn't seem to care. Her mind was drifting back toward George's ship. George kept urging Julie to move to Greece quickly, despite initial doubts. Julie's heart wavered at his sweet promises. She began planning to relocate to Greece with her daughter. On June 19, 1998, Julie flew to Vancouver, where she met George. Aboard the Galaxy, they stayed in his modest crew cabin. To Julie, the Galaxy was more than just a ship, it symbolized love, as the sunset cast golden light over the sea. It created a romantic setting. On July 4, 1998, Julie returned to New Jersey and decided to resume her modeling career. She immersed herself in the gym, working hard to regain her figure. By mid-July, she had lost 20 pounds and happily faxed George, telling him she was being invited to bars for promotions. However, George harshly criticized her, warning that she shouldn't let other men see her seductive charm. Under George's disapproval, Julie turned down her next modeling job, unaware that she was being controlled. She believed this was just George's way of showing care, something Tim had never done. A few days later, Julie and George got engaged, planning to marry as soon as Julie finalized her divorce. To show his love, George proposed with a cheap gold ring. Though the dolphin-shaped ring looked gaudy, Julie still happily showed it off to her friends as a sweet surprise. At the end of July, Tim received a $7,000 phone bill and immediately called Julie's mother. Unable to keep the secret, her mother confessed about Julie and George's affair. Tim, helpless, said that if this was truly what Julie wanted, she should hurry up with the divorce so they could both be free. On August 28th, Julie booked George a flight to her hometown. Filled with excitement, she hugged George tightly and brought him home. In the following days, she took him shopping at malls, buying him bracelets and an expensive suit. To help George deal with his dental issues and baldness, Julie called an old friend to ask if he could help George get treatment, but was immediately turned down. She later found a hair transplant ad in a magazine and paid $1,600 to book an appointment. This act infuriated Julie's mother, who disliked George's bald head and blamed him for ruining her daughter's family. During his unemployed days, George frequently used Julie's credit cards excessively, especially while she was working night shifts. In September, Julie's divorce was finally finalized, and Tim agreed to pay her $600,000 in the coming months. Julie officially introduced George to her family, where he bragged about having worked on the world's second-largest ship. Despite trying to act successful, his true nature soon emerged. During an argument between Julie and her mother, George suddenly yelled and punched a wall. He then grabbed Julie's mother by the neck and warned her not to speak to Julie that way again. Julie's mother stormed out and called the police. George was arrested, and his release was conditional. He had to return to Greece immediately. Initially, after the divorce, Tim had no interest in interfering with Julie's life. But when he learned from a friend that Julie and George planned to take their daughter to Greece, he became furious and called Julie, demanding that the child stay in the US. This time, both Tim's friends and Julie's family agreed that taking a 3-year-old to Greece could deeply impact her development, psychology, and future recovery. In the end, Julie left the child behind and decided to go to Greece alone. On October 20th, Julie flew to Greece, happily telling the man she loved that she had received $600,000 from the divorce. That amount could help George start a taxi company in his hometown of Kavala. To welcome Julie, George's family threw a party. Before it began, George sternly warned Julie not to mention her previous marriage or child because his family was very sensitive about such things. However, George's family didn't understand why a beautiful, wealthy woman from America would want to move to their poor little town. Julie proudly pointed to her cheap engagement ring and said it was all for love. According to Julie and Tim's divorce agreement, Tim would pay Julie $120,000 immediately after the divorce, and then continue to pay $5,000 per month until the total of $600,000 was reached. On December 8th, Julie and George woke up early and went to the bank to open a joint account, depositing a check worth $80,000. Julie also carried $18,000 in cash, eager to fit in with George's community. Julie soon realized that this small northern Greek town couldn't compare to the wealth and comfort of New Jersey. Due to the language barrier, Julie had difficulty communicating with the locals, which made her homesick, missing her friends and her daughter. The longing for home made her restless and unable to bear the remote town. She hated the greasy food and the nearly mandatory 3-hour afternoon siesta. On December 22nd, George's mother was shocked to discover that Julie had been previously married and started shouting in Greek. George immediately took Julie to a hotel, but the hotel expenses quickly overwhelmed him. By December 28th, George and Julie argued after Julie complained that the town was nothing like America. George's eyes became vacant as he suddenly grabbed Julie by the neck. Luckily, one of George's friends was present and pulled him away. For the first time, Julie felt death's shadow looming. Realizing George was not the ideal man she had imagined, she wanted to report him to the police, but George's friend assured her that George was simply tired and acting out. As time passed, the tension between George and Julie escalated. On January 4, 1999, Julie was informed that her luggage had arrived in Athens and she could retrieve it. However, she was overwhelmed with sadness. Getting the luggage meant no turning back. She would be stuck in this town forever. Anxious, Julie contacted friends in the U.S., who advised her to marry George as planned and wait for him to finish military service before returning to America. On January 8th, George and Julie registered their marriage, planning to hold the wedding on January 23rd, but the silence between them became disturbing. Julie, once sociable and full of life, now isolated herself. Her love was gradually replaced by fear, especially after George's previous assault. Even with the marriage certificate, both knew the relationship couldn't last. George's dream of a wealthy life was crumbling, and he suspected Julie was planning to leave him. At 5:00 p.m., George made a chilling decision. If he couldn't have Julie, no one could on that cold and damp night. George drove Julie along the coastal road toward Athens to collect her luggage. When they reached a deserted spot, he stopped the car. Julie's heart pounded. A cold sweat trickled down her neck, and suddenly, George turned and strangled her. Julie screamed and tried to fight him off, but George squeezed with all his strength, like wringing out a wet towel. Once it was over, George placed Julie's body in the car trunk and drove back to town. On the way, he stopped for gasoline and slowed down to search for a place to dispose of her body. He eventually chose a dirt road leading to 2 small lakes. He poured gasoline over Julie's body, but because of the drizzle, the fire wouldn't catch, so he had to take her back to the car. Back home, he tried to pack the body and the evidence into a suitcase, but Julie didn't fit. He eventually used a tool to remove her head before sealing the suitcase. Returning to the lake, George poured more gasoline, but again failed to ignite it. Frustrated, he tossed the suitcase into the water and watched it sink. Then he threw Julie's burned head off the edge of a cliff. For the next 2 days, George hid in the apartment he and Julie had just rented. He cleaned up every trace, destroyed her passport and credit cards to explain her disappearance. He began fabricating an alibi, believing if he could deceive the police, he'd be safe. George withdrew money from their joint account, but first he called his mother, gasping as he asked if they had seen Julie. He then contacted his father in Athens, claiming he suspected Julie had gone missing. Soon after, George and his father went to the local police station to file a missing person report. The police were sympathetic as part of routine procedure, but disappearances were common in the area. They didn't take it seriously and advised George to search again. The next morning, George went to the American embassy to report Julie missing, but the staff assumed it was just a typical lover's quarrel. In the afternoon, George called one of Julie's friends, claiming they had gotten lost in Athens. Her friend's first reaction was suspicion that George had assaulted Julie, prompting her to run away. But as time passed and there was still no word from Julie, the friend became worried and contacted George again. He lied, saying a federal investigation had already begun. George tried to sound cheerful but couldn't hide his trembling, insisting he was glad the police were taking it seriously. Not long after, George called again to report that he had been robbed and lost his passport, along with photos of Julie. On January 21st, when he went to the bank to withdraw money from their joint account. George became angry upon learning that the $90,000 US check had not yet cleared, so he couldn't access the funds. Meanwhile, Julie's friends and family began to realize something was wrong. They contacted the U.S. Embassy in Athens and television reporters to follow up on Julie's disappearance. The Associated Press also picked up the story, forcing Greek authorities to take the situation seriously. George, as Julie's husband, became the focus of both the police and the media. In front of reporters, George once again recounted Julie's disappearance. He said he had rushed from Kavala to Athens to retrieve her luggage, only for this woman to suddenly vanish. In the interview, George repeatedly referred to Julie as this woman, which raised suspicions. George also brought up the robbery, claiming he was held up at knife point on January 26th. George calmly walked into the Central Police headquarters in Athens. Now more than 2 weeks had passed since Julie was reported missing, and he believed he had committed the perfect crime, leaving no trace for the police to find. When confronted by investigators, George repeated his fabricated alibi, but when the police began asking about Julie's passport, George started to panic. His story began to unravel. 4 hours later, George broke down in tears and confessed that he had murdered Julie, disposed of her body, and thrown it into a lake. He began telling the story of how he met Julie aboard the Galaxy cruise ship and fell in love. George said he had quit his job to live with Julie, though he conveniently omitted the part where he assaulted her mother. He didn't explain why. He left America to return to Greece. George claimed that once they got to Greece, everything changed. Julie didn't like the lifestyle and kept complaining. He wished she would return to the U.S. while he served his mandatory military service, but she refused because she didn't want to be separated. So he suggested that either he skip military service or they flee to the U.S. together. Julie refused, saying he couldn't get a green card if he entered the country illegally. To push her away, George pretended to act violently in order to sabotage the relationship. On the drive to pick up her luggage in Athens, he once again brought up the idea of going back to America, but she still resisted. They argued, and in the heat of the fight, he turned and began to strangle her. When she screamed, he panicked, fearing someone might hear, and he tightened his grip. Soon, he realized she had stopped breathing. George claimed he tried to revive her, performing CPR, but nothing worked. Feeling helpless, he decided to dispose of her body. At this point, George cried and confessed to the police that since the murder, he had tried to end his life 3 times, slashing his wrists and taking pills, but failed each time. By 10:00 p.m., George was handcuffed and placed in a police car alongside officers to help locate Julie. Early the next morning, around 5 a.m., police arrived at the man-made lake where George had stopped. 2 hours later, divers recovered a blackened suitcase from the water. When they opened it, they found Julie's body inside, but her head was missing. Her body was curled up, and due to the cold weather, it had not yet decomposed. Police placed her body into a van and transported it to the forensic lab in Athens around noon. American authorities delivered a letter to the Greek ambassador in Washington to express concern about the case and the hope for swift justice. The case made front-page news in both the U.S. and Greece. Julie's family also received the heartbreaking news. Her ex-husband Tim quickly flew to Greece, hoping to bring Julie back home. On February 2, 1999, Julie finally returned to New Jersey. Her funeral drew massive media attention, forcing Tim to hire security to keep reporters and camera crews away from the church. It was a bitterly cold and windy winter day. 150 of Julie's friends and family gathered at the church to say goodbye. For Julie, a woman who spent her life chasing love, but never truly feeling it, this funeral was proof of how deeply she was loved. During the ceremony, Tim held back tears as he gently stroked the photo of his ex-wife. Lost in memories of their time together, he remembered the ring she once gave him and saw, as if in a dream, the moment they first met. Watching Julie pour everything into her modeling career, Tim never fully understood what she wanted, fame or family. But now he knew Julie simply wanted to be loved. Deeply and fiercely, after the funeral, her family scattered Julie's ashes around Lake Dennisville. On November 27, 1999, George was officially charged with the murder of Julie and the desecration of her body. His lawyer attempted to use an insanity defense, however. 6 weeks earlier, the Kavala court ruled that George had been fully sane at the time of the killing and was legally responsible. On December 6th, exactly 1 year after Julie's death, George was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In October 2002, George appealed, citing good behavior in prison, and the appeals court reduced his sentence to 23 years. He has since been released and is currently living in Komotini, a city in northeastern Greece. Meanwhile, Julie's daughter has grown into a beautiful young woman, inheriting her mother's looks, and is currently studying marketing at university. However, not a single photo of her mother appears in her childhood albums. Julie's ex-husband remained single for the rest of his life, dedicating everything to raising their daughter. Fortunately, the families of Tim and Julie have remained close and supportive, and that is the full story behind this case. What do you think about Julie's story and her yearning for true love? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any more classic true crime stories here on our channel.